Hello everyone, today we are going to learn Chapter 4, The Colonial Era in India, Part 3 from your Social Science textbook. In this video, I'll be covering each and every line from the chapter so you don't miss anything important. Make sure to keep your notebook and pen ready and take notes while watching. This will help you remember the concepts better. You can pause or rewind any time to write things down. So, let's begin. Changing landscapes. The expanding colonial rule impacted nearly every aspect of Indian life, as the rulers were convinced that India should be reshaped according to their superior conceptions. Let us briefly look at a few of those impacts. So, the British slowly took control over more and more parts of India. As their rule grew, it began to affect almost every part of Indian life. Society, economy, culture, education, laws, and even people's daily habits. The British believed that their own ideas and ways of living were better or superior to Indian traditions. Because of this, they tried to change India to match their own beliefs and systems. In this section, we will learn how British rule changed India in different ways. Decline of India's indigenous industries. Before the 18th century, India was renowned for its manufacturing capabilities, particularly in textiles, cotton, silk, wool, jute, hemp, and coir being the chief ones. Indian cotton textiles in particular, with rich and intricate designs, bright colors, and textures ranging from ultra-thin muslins to richly embossed fabrics, were in high demand in many parts of the world. Embossed with the design stand on the cloth in such a way that it stands out in relief. So embossed means a design that is pressed onto the cloth so that it becomes raised. When you touch it, you can feel the pattern standing up from the surface. Indigenous industries means the traditional industries of India, such as handloom weaving, handicrafts, metalwork, small-scale manufacturing, etc. And what does decline of India's indigenous industries mean? It means that India's own traditional industries started becoming weak, losing business, and finally collapsing during British rule. Before the 18th century, India was famous all over the world for its excellent manufacturing, especially textiles, that is, cloth making. India produced many types of clothes such as cotton, silk, wool, jute, hemp, and coir. Indian cotton cloth was the most famous. It had beautiful and detailed designs, bright and attractive colors, different textures from extremely thin and soft muslin to thick, beautifully embossed fabrics. Because of this high quality, Indian textiles were loved and widely demanded in many countries around the world. Let's explore. Do you understand all the terms used above to list and describe Indian textiles? If not, form groups of 4 or 5 and try to find out more. Then compare your findings with the help of your teacher. Do you understand the difficult words used to describe Indian textiles like muslin, hemp, coir, embossed, etc.? If you do not understand some of these terms, then you have to form groups of 4 to 5 students, search for the meanings together, share and compare your answers with each other, and take your teacher's help to confirm the correct meanings. British policy imposed heavy duties on Indian textiles imported into Britain, while forcing India to accept British manufactured goods with minimal tariffs. Moreover, Britain now controlled most of the sea trade as well as exchange rates, so Indian traders found it difficult to export as earlier. The result was the ruin of Indian textile industry. In the 19th century, India's textile exports fell sharply, while Britain's imports into India grew even more sharply. So the British followed policies that destroyed Indian textile industry. First, they put heavy taxes on Indian textiles going to Britain. That is, when Indian cloth was sent to Britain, the British government charged very high import duties, that is, taxes. This made Indian textiles very expensive in Britain, so people stopped buying them. Then, very low taxes on British goods entering India. That is, British machine-made cloth was sent to India with almost no tax. So, British cloth was cheap. and people in India bought it more. Britain controlled sea trade and exchange rates. So most ships and sea routes and the value of currency, that is exchange rates, were controlled by British. Because of this, Indian traders could not easily export their clothes to other countries like before. So the result was Indian textile industry collapsed. Due to all these unfair rules, India's textile exports went down sharply in the 1800s, that is 19th century. And Britain's textile imports into India increased a lot. Communities of skilled artisans who had practiced their craft for generations were reduced to poverty and forced to return to subsistence agriculture on increasingly overtaxed land. As William Bentinck, then Governor General of India, observed in 1834, the bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. So, many Indian families had been skilled artisans, that is, weavers, dyers, metal workers, for many generations. These were people who made beautiful clothes and other handmade items. But because of British policies, their industries collapsed, they lost their income, they became very poor. Since they had no other option, these artisans were forced to go back to farming. But the land was already overworked and heavily taxed, so even farming did not give them a good life. William Bentinck, the Governor General of India, said in 1834, "The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India." It is a figure of speech that shows how badly the cotton weavers suffered during British rule. They lost their work, had no money, and many died due to hunger and poverty. It was a very strong way of saying that the Indian weaving community was destroyed by British policies. Similar scenarios unfolded for India's manufacturers of iron, steel, paper, and other goods. India's share of the world GDP kept declining throughout the colonial rule, reaching hardly 5% at the time of independence. In less than 2 centuries, one of the richest lands of the world had become one of the poorest. So just like the cotton weavers, the people who made iron, steel, paper and other goods in India also faced the same problems during British rule. Their industries were ruined because British goods were pushed into India and Indian products were not supported. Because of this, India's economy kept becoming weaker and weaker. India's share in the world's total wealth, that is GDP, went down continuously. By the time India became independent in 1947, our share in the world economy was only about 5%. So in just less than 200 years, a country that was once one of the richest in the world became one of the poorest because of colonial policies. Dismantling traditional governance structures. Before British colonization, India possessed well-organized systems of local self-governance. Village councils managed community affairs, resolved disputes, and organized public works such as irrigation, roads, etc. Regional kingdoms maintained complex administrative structures that had evolved over centuries to address local needs and conditions. Charles Metcalfe, an acting Governor General in the 1830s, described the system and its efficiency in this important statement. Dismantling means breaking down or destroying. Traditional governance structures means the old systems of ruling that India had before the British. So, before the British came to India, our country already had strong and well-organized systems to manage local affairs. In villages, there were village councils like today's panchayats. These councils solved disputes, took care of community matters, and looked after important public works like irrigation canals, village roads, and other common facilities. In the same way, the regional kingdoms, that is the bigger states and empires, had their own administrative systems. These systems had developed over many centuries and were designed to suit local needs, culture, and conditions. Charles Metcalfe, who was an acting Governor General in 1830s, observed how efficient this system was. He praised India's local governance and made a very important statement describing its strength and effectiveness. The village communities or little republics having nearly everything they want within themselves. They seem to last where nothing else lasts. Dynasty after dynasty tumbles down, revolution succeeds to revolution, but the village community remains the same. This union of the village communities, each one forming a separate little state in itself, has contributed more than any other cause to the preservation of the people of India. So Charles Metcalfe says that the Indian village communities were like little republics. As they were self-sufficient, each village had almost everything it needed: food, crafts, trade, basic governance. They did not depend too much on outside rulers. They remained stable. Even when kings changed, empires fell, revolutions happened, the village system continued without collapse. Villages kept functioning the same way for hundreds of years. They acted like small states. Each village worked like a mini state, managing its own affairs, law and order, welfare, and public works. Metcalfe believed that the strong village system helped preserve Indian society and culture even during political turmoil. According to him, no other factor protected India as much as its village communities did. The British systematically dismantled these indigenous governance systems, replacing them with a centralized bureaucracy designed primarily to facilitate tax collection and maintain order rather than promote public welfare. This transformation destroyed centuries-old mechanisms of community decision-making. Bureaucracy means a system of government or management that operates through a large number of officials following strict rules, often resulting in a complicated and slow process. So, the British removed India's traditional village and local governance systems and replaced them with a centralized administrative system. Their new system focused mainly on collecting taxes and maintaining law and order, not on helping the people or improving their lives. As a result, the old methods by which communities made decisions together and solved their own problems were broken and lost. The introduction of British courts of law disregarded customary laws and practices that had governed Indian communities for generations. While presented as modernization, this imposition of a foreign system unsuited to India alienated ordinary Indians from the judicial system, creating courts that were expensive, time-consuming, and conducted in a foreign language. So, when the British brought their own laws to India, they ignored the traditional rules and customs that Indians have been following for hundreds of years. They said it was modern, but these new laws did not fit India's needs. The codes became too costly, too slow, and used a foreign language that common people could not understand. Because of this, ordinary Indians felt separated and powerless in the new legal system. Transforming Indian education, creating brown Englishmen. Education became a powerful tool for the creation of a class of Indians who would serve British interests. In earlier centuries, India had diverse educational traditions, pathashalas, madrasas, viharas, and many forms of apprenticeships learning. These institutions transmitted not only practical knowledge but also cultural values and traditions. So now British used education as a tool to create a group of Indians who would think like them and help run the government in their favor. Before the British, India had many different kinds of traditional schools. Pathshalas, that is traditional Hindu schools, madrasas, that is Islamic learning centers, and viharas, Buddhist learning centers, and many apprenticeship systems where students learned skills by working with experts. These traditional systems taught not only reading and writing but also Indian culture, values, and practical knowledge that had been passed down for generations. Even in the early 19th century, British reports reported hundreds of thousands of village schools across India. For instance, 1 lakh to 1,50,000 of them in Bengal and Bihar up to 1830, where young natives are taught reading, writing, and arithmetic upon a system so economical and at the same time so simple and effectual. So even in the early 1800s, India already had a huge number of village schools. British officials themselves wrote reports saying that there were 1 lakh to 1,50,000 schools in Bengal and Bihar alone by around 1830. In these schools, children were taught reading, writing and arithmetic, that is, basic maths. The British were surprised because the Indian system was very economical, that is, very little cost, very simple and very effective in teaching students. So, India had a strong and widespread traditional education system even before the British introduced their own system. A sharp turning point in India's educational history was marked by the notorious 1835 Minute on Indian Education of British historian and politician Thomas B. Macaulay. In it, although he admitted that he had no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic, he expressed his conviction that European knowledge was vastly superior to India's. I have never found one among them, Orientalist, who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Indians therefore needed British education whose objective would be to create a class of Indians who would be Indian in blood and color but English in taste, in opinions, in morals and in intellect. Orientalist, a largely obsolete term to designate a scholar of the Orient, that is, regions from West Asia to the Far East. In India, Orientalists, now called Indologists, were often scholars of Sanskrit, Pali, Persian and other languages. Obsolete means something which is no longer used and has been replaced by something newer or better. So, an Orientalist was a scholar who studied the languages, cultures and history of Asian regions, especially India, West Asia and East Asia. In India, Orientalists were experts in Sanskrit, Pali, Persian and other traditional Indian languages. Today, the word isn't used much. We now call such scholars Indologists. Notorious means famous for a bad reason. So, a very important change in Indians' education system happened in 1835 because of a note written by Thomas B. Macaulay, a British politician and historian. This note is called the Minute on Indian Education. Macaulay openly said that he did not know Sanskrit or Arabic, but he still believed that European knowledge was far better than Indian knowledge. He even claimed that one shelf of European books was more valuable than all the literature of India and Arabia. Because of this belief, he argued that Indians should be educated in English, not in their own traditional languages. His main goal was to create a group of Indians who would be Indian in appearance, but English in thinking, taste, morals, and opinions. This group would help the British rule India more easily. Although a few prominent British Orientalists argued that Indian students should be left to study in their own languages, Macaulay's policy gained the upper hand and India's traditional schools slowly disappeared. While English became a language of prestige associated with the colonial masters, resulting in lasting divisions in Indian society between English-educated elites and the masses. So some British scholars, that is Orientalists, believed that Indian students should continue learning in their own languages like Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic or their regional languages. But Macaulay's policy, that is English medium education, became more powerful and was finally followed by the government. Because of this, traditional Indian schools slowly disappeared. The old village schools, Pathasalas, Madrasas and Gurukuls began to decline because English education became more important. So English became a prestige language. English was linked with government jobs, higher status, British rulers. So people began to think that learning English meant progress and success. And the division in society increased. That is, a small group of Indians who studied in English became the elite. Elite means the richest, most powerful, best educated or best trained group in a society. and this group got better jobs and power. But the large majority who did not know English remained ordinary masses with fewer opportunities. This created a long-lasting gap in Indian society. The new education system served multiple colonial objectives. It created a pool of Indian clerks and minor officials who could staff the lower ranks of the colonial administration at a fraction of the cost of British personnel. It also sidelined traditional sources of knowledge and authority, creating generations of Indians disconnected from their own cultural heritage. So the British introduced a new education system in India and it mainly served their own purposes. First, it created cheap workers for British officers. They needed many people to work as clerks, translators, assistants, and low-level officers. Indians who studied English could do these jobs and the British could pay them very low salaries, much cheaper than hiring British workers. So this education system saved money for the colonial government and traditional Indian knowledge was pushed aside. India earlier had rich learning systems like Sanskrit, Persian, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, arts, etc. But the British replaced this with English-based education. As a result, old learning centers declined, traditional scholars lost respect, Indian students grew disconnected from their culture, history and heritage, and generations were shaped to think like the British. The new system created Indians who followed British ideas, admired European culture and knew little about their own traditions. Think about it. What exactly did Macaulay mean when he wrote that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia? And why should he want to make Indians English in taste, in opinions, in morals and in intellect? How does this relate to the civilizing mission mentioned at the start of the chapter? Ask your teacher to guide a class debate on these questions. So you need to understand Macaulay's mindset, his goals and how his ideas supported the British belief that they were bringing civilization to India. So what did Macaulay mean by the line, a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia? Macaulay meant that he believed European knowledge, books and science were far superior to the traditional knowledge and literature of India and Arabia. He admitted that he did not know any Indian languages, yet he judged the literature as inferior. This shows his deep disrespect and ignorance toward India's rich intellectual traditions. And why should he want to make Indians English in taste, in opinions, in morals and in intellect? Macaulay wanted to create a group of Indians who would think like the British, support British ideas and values, help run the colonial administration, obey and cooperate with the British government. Such people would make it easier and cheaper for the British to rule India because they would act as loyal intermediaries between the rulers and the Indian population. Then, next question, how does this relate to the civilizing mission mentioned at the start of the chapter? The civilizing mission was the British belief that their culture was superior. Indians needed to be improved or civilized. Western education, language and values should replace India's traditions. Macaulay's education policy directly supported this idea. By promoting English education and dismissing Indian knowledge, he tried to reshape Indian society to match British culture. This helped justify colonial rule as if the British were doing India a favor. Reshaping economic structures to serve imperial needs. Imperial means related to an empire, that is a powerful country that controls other countries or regions. So in this context, imperial means British Empire. Imperial needs means what the British Empire wanted for its own benefit. This line means that the British changed India's economy in such a way that it would benefit the British Empire, not India. They made sure that whatever India produced, traded or paid in taxes would help Britain become richer. So the British did not develop India for Indians. They changed everything mainly to serve their own needs. The British transformed India's economy from a self-sufficient agricultural system supplemented by craft and manufacture production into a supplier of raw materials for British industry and a market forced to buy British goods. Without going into the technical details of this economic transformation, let us take the example of the construction of India's vast railway network, often cited as a colonial blessing. So the British changed India's economy completely. Earlier, India produced its own food, clothes and goods through farming and local crafts. But under British rule, India was forced to send raw materials like cotton, indigo, jute to Britain and buy British-made goods like finished cloth. So India's economy now worked mainly to benefit British factories, not Indians. Let us take the example of railways, which many people think were a gift from the British. While the railways did bring people closer together and integrated India's internal market, it was designed primarily to move raw materials from the interior to ports for export and to distribute British manufactured goods throughout India. Railway routes largely ignored existing trade patterns to serve colonial economic interest. Another purpose was to move armies quickly from their cantonments if they had to fight a distant rebellion or war. So, the British built railways in India, and these railways helped people travel and connected different parts of the country. But the main purpose was not to help Indians, it was to help the British. The railways were planned mainly to take raw materials like cotton, coal, jute from inside India to ports so they could be shipped to Britain. They also helped the British send their manufactured goods from the ports to all parts of India, creating a big market for British products. The British did not design the routes to match India's old trade routes. The routes were made to support colonial profit, not Indian needs. Another important purpose, railways allowed the British to move their soldiers quickly to stop rebellions or fight wars. So, though railways helped India later, they were originally built for British economic and military advantage, not for the benefit of Indians. Figure 4.15, a steam locomotive of the Madras Railway, one of the companies operating the rail network in British India in 1860. So, figure 4.15 shows a steam locomotive used by the Madras Railway around 1860. A steam locomotive is an early type of train engine. Instead of electricity or diesel, it worked by burning coal. The Madras Railway was one of the earliest railway companies built by the British in India. It helped connect big cities and towns in the southern part of India. In 1860, there were no cars, buses or planes. Trains were the fastest way to travel long distances. Railways were used to transport raw materials, British goods and sometimes soldiers across India as part of the colonial railway system. This picture shows how trains looked more than 160 years ago. Besides, the construction of India's railways was not a gift from the colonial rulers to India. Most of it was paid for by Indian tax revenue, which means that Indian funded infrastructure that primarily served in British strategic and commercial interest instead of being focused on serving the people's needs. The same can be said of the telegraph network. So, the railways were not a gift from the British. India did not give them for free. Most of the money used to build the railways came from Indian taxes. So, Indians paid for the railways, but the system mainly helped the British to move their goods, raw materials and soldiers. The same thing happened with the telegraph network. Indians paid for it, but it was mostly used for British administration and control, not for helping ordinary people. Even the administrative cost of colonialism were borne by Indian subjects. The colonial administrative apparatus, military installations and the lavish lifestyles of British officials in India were all financed by Indian taxation. In short, Indians funded their own subjugation. Apparatus means the structure and method of operation of an organization. Here, the British government system in India. Military installations means army buildings and camps where soldiers live, train or store weapons. Subjugation refers to the act of bringing someone or something under control, often through force, losing freedom. So, the British did not pay to run their government in India. Indians paid for everything. The British officers, their army, their buildings, and even the luxurious lifestyle of British officers. So, the money to maintain British rule came from Indian taxes. In simple words, Indians were forced to pay for the very system that controlled and oppressed them. This is why we say Indians funded their own subjugation. Early resistance movements challenging colonial authority. India was such an enormous source of wealth, natural and human resources for the British that they nicknamed her the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. And they asserted that India would forever remain part of the British Empire on which the sun never sets. So India was extremely valuable to the British because it gave them huge amounts of money, raw materials and manpower. That is why the British called India the jewel in the crown, meaning India was the most precious part of their empire. They also used to say that the British Empire was so big that the sun never sets on it, meaning the empire was spread across so many parts of the world that it was always daytime in at least one of the British territories. They believed that India would always remain under their control. Think about it. What is meant by the sun never sets on the British Empire? Do you think this was a correct statement? The phrase the sun never sets on the British Empire means that the British Empire was so large and spread across so many parts of the world that at any moment it was daytime in at least one of the places they ruled. So, even when it was night in one British colony, it was daytime in another. It describes how huge the British Empire was. So, was this statement correct? Yes, at that time it was correct geographically because the British controlled territories in Asia, Africa, Europe, the Americas and Australia, almost all time zones. But morally, the statement hides the fact that the empire was built through conquest and exploitation. Colonies like India suffered under British rule. People lost their freedom and wealth. So, the statement is true in size, but it does not make British rule right or fair. However, almost from the beginning of the British conquest of India, resistance movements manifested to try and repel this self-imposed guest. We will briefly survey a few such movements, but before we do so, let us have a good look at the map of the British Indian Empire, figure 4.16. The red and pink territories are those directly under British administration, while the yellow ones are the princely states we discussed earlier. The black lines stand for the railway lines. So, from the very beginning of British rule in India, many groups of Indians did not accept the British as rulers. They began different resistance movements to push out this guest who came as a trader but stayed on as a ruler. Before learning about these movements, let's look at the map of British India, figure 4.16. Red and pink areas, these were regions directly ruled by the British government. Yellow areas, these were princely states. They had Indian kings or Nawabs, but they were under British control in many ways. Black lines, these show the railway routes built during British rule. This map helps you to understand how large the British controlled area was. This is how the Indian subcontinent looked under British rule in the year 1909. Let's explore. Examine the map. What are the main differences with the map of today's India in terms both of borders and of names? There are many differences between the 1909 map of British India and the map of modern India. The major changes are borders have completely changed. India was much larger in 1909. British India included the territories of present-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, that is Burma, until 1937. So, the boundaries shown in 1909 are not the boundaries of present-day India. Partition in 1947 changed the borders. Pakistan was carved out in the northwest, Bangladesh was carved out in the east. Many princely states were separate. In 1909, hundreds of princely states in yellow on the map existed with their own borders. Today, all those states have merged into the Indian Union, so their borders no longer exist. Names of regions were different. old provinces versus new states. The map shows names such as Punjab Province, Bombay Presidency, Madras Presidency, Bengal Presidency, United Provinces, Central Provinces, Rajputana Agency, Hyderabad State. These names do not exist today. Modern India has states like Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, etc., which were formed after independence. Burma, that is Myanmar, shown as part of British India. Today, Myanmar is a separate country, not part of India. So, British India was much larger geographically. Many countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar were part of it. Old British provinces and princely states have been reorganized. The names and borders were completely different from today's India. So with this, we have completed the part 3 of the chapter, The Colonial Era in India. I hope you found it easy to understand. If you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching. We will see you again in our next video. Bye bye.